If you were around Santa Monica in November 1986, and if you somehow found yourself in attendance at that year's American Film Market event, and if you were a fan of the Marvel Comics title SpiderMan, then you were no doubt excited to see the following presentation pop up on the big screen.
Within this unsuspecting city, history's greatest experiment creates tomorrow's greatest superhero. SpiderMan, the movie. A live-action spectacular directed by Joe Zito, based on the characters created by Stan Lee.
With hindsight, we know that Canon Films' SpiderMan the movie, as directed by Joe Zito, was never to be. It was to be the cinematic debut of the world-famous superhero, and would have presented the story of Peter Parker, a teenager whose ordinary life is transformed into something greater when he is bitten by a radioactive spider. Peter would then wage a one-man crusade against crime in the costumed identity of the Amazing Spider-Man, leading to a dramatic battle that sees millions of lives hanging in the balance, high above Manhattan's glittering skyline. The feature film rights to Spider-Man were held by Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, the chairman and president of Canon Films. Golan and Globus had purchased the company when it hit financial trouble, and they immediately launched a 10-point manifesto, vowing to supply a minimum of 10 quality films a year. Golan had previously worked for indie icon Roger Corman, learning the principles of budget-on-a-shoestring filmmaking. From there, Golan got together with Globus, and the two made a number of no-budget titles in their homeland of Israel. Once at Canon, they would churn out movies at a rate of more than 20 a year. The two cousins were super passionate about cinema, or at least Golan was. Globus was perhaps more passionate about business, but together they had a vision of sorts. The only thing Menachem Golan cared about was making movies. Some were great, some were poor, some turned a profit, others lost millions. But from his youth right up until his final hours on Earth, all Golan ever cared about was movies. But sadly, as is often the case with the rise and fall of any empire, mistakes were made. The duo had paid an upfront fee to license the characters Spider-Man and Captain America from Marvel. The movie deal promised Marvel a back-end percentage of any future box office revenue. The option was a 5-year, potentially extendable agreement. And, depending on which source you trust, the initial fee, to be paid in installments, seems to fall somewhere between $225,000 and $400,000. The allure of realizing superheroes in a motion picture was at an all-time low. Richard Lester's Superman 3 had disappointed audiences 2 years prior, and Tim Burton's Batman was still another 5 years away from redefining the genre. Golan was on another wavelength when it came to making movies, and when it came to Spider-Man, it wasn't necessarily a higher wavelength. One for cashing in by chasing and imitating the fads of the day. His movies had taught him that anything featuring ninjas was the key to success in America. Hence, Spider-Man's ninja flying through space pose on Canon's promotional material. The first person given the official commission of writing a Spider-Man film treatment for Canon Films was Leslie Stevens. Stevens had directed the William Shatner horror movie Incubus, and had worked with Canon on writing a sequel to the movie Joe called Citizen Joe that would remain unproduced. Stevens had also written multiple uncredited drafts of the screenplay for the 1983 movie Sahara, based on a story by Golan in what would prove to be a costly flop. Stevens had previously co-developed Universal's feature-length Buck Rogers in the 25th Century and the subsequent NBC television show, which saw him adapting and discarding elements of the classic comic strip in order to update and modernize the story for viewers unfamiliar with the character. The 2-season run of Buck Rogers was considered a success, and Marvel then hired him to work on their title, Dazzler. The character had been created at the behest of Alice Donenfeld. This being the days of disco, the idea was to introduce the character via the X-Men comics and eventually tie in a music deal with a record label. Everyone was impressed with the character and origin story that Shooter developed, and plans quickly shifted from a 30-minute animated piece into a full-length, feature-length film. Shooter's Dazzler treatment gained traction and much interest at the 1980 Cannes Film Festival. Star Bo Derek was quickly attached in principle. As Shooter recalls, quote, "Marvel commissions a screenplay by Leslie Stevens. Why not me? I was the horse who got us there. But suddenly, because it was Hollywood, for real and big time, I was just a comic book writer. They decided they needed a screenwriter. Stevens ignored what I had written completely and wrote a piece of crap that defies description. In those days, despite the reasonable success of the first Superman movie, comics were still thought of as silly and campy, so that's what Stevens went for. It was moronic. Stevens also discarded the light powers and gave Dazzler the power to make people tell the truth. Why the name then? Oh well. And so, any Dazzler film remained unproduced. But Stevens was about to trample more sacred ground with his next Marvel job, Canon Films' upcoming SpiderMan. As Stevens worked from a jumping-off point by Golan, nobody believes anymore in features based on comic books, Golan had said, and so the two managed to completely ignore the Spider-Man already established to readers and fashion their own body horror tale, which would interpret the character's name quite literally. Stevens was the one who first suggested that Spider-Man would have gotten more than just super strength and the ability to stick to walls from that radioactive spider bite. Stevens' treatment would contain the organic web shooters that remain a through line to James Cameron's treatment up until the Sam Raimi movie. Stevens would then skip all of the basics of the origin story and conjure a central plot that would amp up Peter's metamorphosis. Peter is a science lab photographer and student of ninjutsu who transforms into a giant spider and back into a human until the completion to spider is almost permanent. An increasingly suicidal Peter is horrified by this curse that he sees as a fate worse than death. The architect of his mutation is a scientist who has developed a basement full of genetic experiments. Parker is deliberately blasted in radiation by the evil head of the company, a mad scientist whose purpose is global domination. The scientist uses a seductive female to entice Peter to join his master race of mutants. When the plan fails, Peter is put in a "you're with us or you're against us" conflict. Peter uses his tarantula mutation to battle against a gauntlet of various creatures unleashed by the evil Doctor. It's a fair assumption that Stevens was pulling together various sources of inspiration. All except the Spider-Man comic books, that is. Anyone familiar with H.G. Wells' work would recognize his themes. The concept of evolution versus the divine, and the ethical pitfalls of a scientific inevitability. Stevens had previously adapted Wells' The Invisible Man twice for television, as co-creator of both The Gemini Man, in which secret agent Sam Case is exposed to radiation in an underwater explosion and rendered invisible, and as a writer for The Invisible Man, in which David McCallum's Daniel Weston, while working for a company called the Clay Corporation and doing experiments in teleportation, discovers the side effect of his work is the ability to turn objects invisible. The Wellsian slant on the amazing Spider-Man wasn't appreciated by those at Marvel. It's been rightfully said, more than once by now, that Golan didn't fully grasp the concept of Peter Parker and the radioactive spider bite. And rather than consult someone who did, he figured he'd reinvent the character and create a monster. Thankfully, the misjudgment was a short-lived brainstorm that went nowhere. And less than a couple of months would pass before those close to Canon's higher-ups would persuade them to approach the material in the correct way. Canon would instead let Stevens write and direct the movie Three Kinds of Heat, starring his wife. And his Spider-Man treatment would remain unfilmed, yet forever discussed. I think if you take away any reference to Peter Parker, you have a Dr. Moreau, Swamp Thing, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Fly, Wolfman drive-through movie throwback that sounds potentially interesting. The treatment's currently the property of Sony. I hope somebody films it. Following completion of the Stevens treatment, Canon would market Toby Hooper to the press as the director of the upcoming film. The director of Salem's Lot and the Texas Chain Saw Massacre had found himself in relative exile from the industry following the controversy of the Poltergeist shoot, where, despite the film bearing Hooper's name as director, A combination of personal issues and Spielberg's enthusiastic yet domineering presence led to an on-set power struggle and the controversial LA Times article where Spielberg was quoted as saying, "Toby isn't what you'd call a take charge sort of guy. He's just not a strong presence on a movie set. If a question was asked and an answer wasn't immediately forthcoming, I'd jump up and say what we could do." There were later verified as true whispers that the cast and crew began taking their orders from Spielberg, leading the Directors Guild of America to force the E.T. director to take out a full-page apology to Hooper. Hooper was eventually removed in post-production and would always decline to speak of the experience in any real depth. After a year of seeing his projects pulled, including a potential Poltergeist prequel, Golan and Globus would offer Hooper a 3-picture deal. There was a film adaptation of the Colin Wilson novel Space Vampires, later retitled Life Force. There was Invaders from Mars and SpiderMan. If things went well with those 3 projects, Canon was hoping Hooper would find time to produce a sequel to the Texas Chain Saw Massacre and an already fully scripted sci-fi title, Pinocchio the Robot, starring Lee Marvin. Hooper would say, quote, "Things were really corporate at Canon by the time I got there. But, I could go into their office and in 90 seconds get a green light to do a movie based on a pitch. No intermediate development of script or anything. They'd ask me, 'Toby, when can we have this on screen?' I must say that I really like that." Life Force was given a $25 million budget, which at the time was an enormous sum equal to the blockbusters of the day. Unfortunately, Life Force didn't fare as well as hoped. Hooper says, quote, "I think the big problem is that they tried to market that movie as a serious science fiction film, which it wasn't. The expectations that were given to that film were like 2001: A Space Odyssey." Hooper had been linked publicly with the Leslie Stevens treatment, but behind the scenes, Marvel's film people and Stan Lee managed to get word to Golan that his mutant spider ninja film wasn't going to succeed in doing anything other than alienating comic book fans. And so there was a period of time where Hooper's name was still being used in trade ads, but no story had yet been given formal approval. After Hooper was coerced into directing, rather than producing, Texas Chain Saw Massacre 2 in super record time to meet a release date, the film replaced SpiderMan on Hooper's schedule. As the sequel fell behind and the budget continued to increase, Canon would grow impatient, and even attempted to have him replaced by a company workhorse who could finish the film cheaply. Such a move would have seen Golan and Globus in breach of Hooper's contract. Instead, they removed him from the Spider-Man project. The company also disliked Hooper's tonal shift on the Texas Chain Saw sequel. This, coupled with the overspend on Invaders from Mars, signaled the imminent end of their collaboration. The director would later say, quote, "The problem with Spider-Man is that when I looked at it, I felt that we just did not have the money or technology to do it properly. We would occasionally speak about it, but after I did the Texas Chain Saw Massacre 2, I'd fulfilled my contract at Canon, and they started to have their financial problems too. I love those guys though, and I wish we could have done Spider-Man."